Good day and welcome to a very brief overview of the mental health system and mental health services here in the United States. Services that are geared toward children and youth. While it is estimated that the majority of children and youth will experience a mental health issue sometime during their lives, at any one time it is believed that 1/5 of youngsters have a mental health issue that is causing them distress or causing emotional behavioral difficulties. With regard to our students who have emotional or behavioral difficulties, mental health issues in kids outnumber physical health issues. But that's not where the research and the intervention money is going. But we will find that most of our kids who are labeled as emotionally disturbed or should have that label in order to gain necessary services, that they'll be sitting in the general education classroom, especially with the emphasis now from the inclusion movement. However, we will find that we have teachers working with these youngsters in the entire cascade of services that was identified by Dino back in the 1970s. You may be teaching in a self-contained classroom within a general education school, and you'll have somewhere between 9 and 15 youngsters who have emotional or behavioral troubles that are interfering with their success in school. However, we will also find youngsters in self-contained schools, entire schools that work with kids who have emotional or behavioral troubles. We may find these youngsters in institutional settings, either a low security one or a high security one with locked rooms, locked doors, and high level security procedures. But our kids are the least likely to have teachers who actually have certification and training in working with that particular group. So our kids are least likely to have a teacher who understands their needs and is able to supply the necessary academic services and just mentorship and mental health services that are provided in the classroom. What you are about to see on your screen is the federal definition for identifying youngsters as having emotional disturbance. Back in the day when PL 94142 and the Education of All Handicapped Children Act came out, the original terminology was severe emotional disturbance. But advocacy groups pointed out that no other disability category requires the word severe. That condition needs to be severe in order to obtain services. There are moderate emotional disturbances and perhaps mild emotional disturbances that can benefit from the services that we provide. The definition you're going to see is almost word for word from Eli Bauer's 1976 book. And Eli Bauer was the head of the committee that was coming up with the definitions in the regulations that explained PL 94142 back in 1976. And you see here the various points that were brought into play that a youngster who meets any one of these criteria could be labeled severely emotionally disturbed at that time, now emotionally disturbed. However, Eli Bauer wrote later on that he has no idea where this last point comes from. It was not in the definition that was forwarded to the U.S. Department of Education. That emotional disturbance will include schizophrenia, a misinterpretation of environment. But the term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted. Now, this term had no definition. and in fact still doesn't have a fully accepted, across the spectrum of our profession, a fully accepted definition. Those who advocate for failing to serve kids who are socially maladjusted say that term is equivalent to conduct disorder, one of the diagnoses in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Do be aware that professional groups led by the Council for Children with Behavior Disordered, a unit of the Council for Exceptional Children, the largest advocacy group with regards to special education, and 20 other professional organizations concerned with mental health issues said we ought to get rid of this clause at the end. It serves no purpose, and why wouldn't we want to serve youngsters who are aggressive, manipulative, defiant, they victimize others, they fail to feel empathy? These are the kids we ought to be working with to give them better life chances. Unfortunately, politicians and administrators under political pressures, make the decisions, not those who lead groups concerned with our kids. And so, this is the definition that is used in order to guarantee services to kids who have emotional and behavioral challenges. However, in order to get Medicaid funds and medical insurance funds and Medicare funds, another criteria must be met. And that is the diagnostic criteria found for different mental health disorders in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, their 6th edition. Oh, we see DSM-5. Well, there's DSM-1, 2, 3, 4, and then a text revision of number 4, and so that was the 5th edition. And so DSM-5 is really the 6th edition. This diagnostic manual has been getting bigger and bigger with every revision, except the 5th. They've noticed that the book was getting mighty thick and that a lot of folks were saying, gee, perhaps some normal variations are being identified as mental health illnesses. And so the number has dropped from, in DSM-4 TR, the text revision, from 365 different mental illnesses, one for every day of the year, down to 297. So to make a long story short, too late, there are 2 types of labels that a youngster could have assigned. There's the one that we use in the schools, emotionally disturbed, or the youngster might be diagnosed with one of the 297 DSM diagnoses. Be aware that many of them are for adults. We have many fewer DSM diagnoses for children. Or a youngster could have both. That while having only a DSM diagnosis, but it doesn't seem to interfere with the child's performance, socialization, academics, or behavior in the school, might just have a DSM diagnosis, but some kids have both. They have issues in school and they have issues outside of school. And as alluded to previously, a youngster who receives a special education label is guaranteed, according to the public law, free and appropriate education. And there'll be a section for our kids in their IEPs called the BIP, the Behavior Intervention Plan. Any child with a disability who also has behavioral challenges and behavioral issues, we have a section of the IEP that's dedicated just to identifying the services and the supports that we are going to provide in order to help that youngster make better behavior choices. And if they have difficulties in the emotional, psychological realm, we'll also be identifying the services that we'll provide for the inner child, not just the external behaviors that we notice. And there's Dino's Cascade, different settings where our youngsters who have the emotional and behavioral challenges could be identified or could be served. We face a number of challenges in providing optimal and appropriate services to our youngsters. It may be that the family denies that there is any condition in need of help, or the educators turn their back on it, perhaps because due to lack of funding. I mean, when it comes time to decide on the school bond, many homeowners are concerned about their taxes and they don't want to vote for all the services and the requests from the school system. And with the limited amount of money that schools have available to them, they've got to make choices as to where that money is spent. And oftentimes our kids are not high on the priority list. So even though a youngster may need services, well, look, we can't afford that curriculum, or we can't afford another paraprofessional, or we can't afford to have that professional development session. And so oftentimes we have teachers teaching our kids who are not well prepared. And whether it's they don't have the knowledge base and so effective interventions aren't placed into the IEP, or, as we said, the lack of funding prohibits effective interventions from being prescribed in that BIP. It may be that we have appropriate procedures that teachers should follow, but they haven't been trained in proficiently implementing them. And a lot of teachers will say, that's not the way I teach, and that's not the way I deal with behavior. They say, if you got to treat these kids equally, not realizing that being treated equally does not mean being treated the same. The focus is on differentiation, not just in the academic material, but also in the behavioral interventions. Unfortunately, some folks believe, you gotta let them know who's boss, and you gotta have the kids suffer the consequences, usually meaning some kind of punitive outcome to that youngster's behavior. We know that punishment does not work. It creates resentment. It makes the situation worse. It's just hard to convince some folks. Yes, there is a dearth of services for our kids in the schools. There are many reasons why, but oftentimes it's one of the big problems is the refrain we hear from some teachers. Hey, this isn't my job. I teach academics. I'm not a mental health worker. Nope, I have to correct that. It is our job. By default, teachers are de facto mental health workers, even though very few of us are trained to be so. Paradigm paralysis? Let me talk about that for a second. It's hard for humans to leave their paradigm, the way they view the world. This is especially so as we age, and speaking as a senior educator, I can tell you that as you get older, your political and social views tend to harden, your educational views. And we have to keep reminding ourselves, stay open, keep learning, accept alternative viewpoints, or at least consider them. But as we age and we gain life experience, we form ideas of which ways are best to do things and how things should be in a better world. We are comfortable in what we understand to be true, and we make new information fit into our worldview. Or else we reject that information as unimportant or wrong. Unfortunately, we're afflicted by paradigm paralysis. We strive to keep our view of the world intact. Then one day we're told that there's a different way. Find out that maybe we don't know as much as we thought we did, or maybe we know nothing if our theoretical viewpoint has just been disproven. And to avoid this possibility of being undereducated or not knowing, we hold on strongly to our beliefs. In conflict, we are right and the other side is wrong. And we see this oftentimes play out in the classroom when a teacher gives a direction to a student. And we see two different world paradigms, two different views on the situation impacting each other. Certainly other factors come into play, the funding we've talked about, and despite our youngsters getting more rights and privileges and access to services, unfortunately we don't have the money provided along with those regulations. And gosh, even if we do provide the services, perhaps because of the stigma associated with having an emotional or behavioral trouble, only 13% of people who have an appointment show up. Of course, what is provided? You might get a total of 1 hour as they try to figure out how to provide services to you, or tell you how those services cannot be provided. So where is somebody with a mental health issue most likely to obtain the services they need? It ain't here. So from whom can we take lessons in order to improve our abilities? Well, as of the 2000 teens, we can take a lesson from Northwestern Europe and Northern North America, our neighbors to the north up in Canada. Now, if you are going to remain inside the states, you'll want to head to either Montana or Baltimore, where they're reported to have the highest quality of service. So what can be done to provide better services to our school kids with EBD? Well, why don't we bring the mental health services into the school? There's a lot of talk about interagency cooperation. There are schools out there that have health clinics, including mental health clinics, right there in the school building, and social services is there, and there's a small office for the police officer who patrols the building and befriends kids. We want to provide more services, especially for our kids whose behavior may not be acting out. The ones the kids don't get noticed because they're still doing the schoolwork or they're not bothering the teacher. And these might be our kids who suffer from depression or some other internalized sort of emotional and behavioral issues. Here is some more information regarding setting up mental health teams in the schools. If you're particularly interested in this, you can pause the presentation at this point and look at the various itemized suggestions. What else might be done? How about some more teacher training? Whether it's having a program like our BD program at Hunter College, which is quite unusual, or whether it's providing professional development sessions so teachers better understand what is going on and are better able to address it. It would be neat if kids at the upper levels of the PBIS triangle were to receive at least 10 sessions with a counselor to address their issues, whether it's at Tier 2 with a small group or Tier 3 individual. If you're not fully familiar with the PBIS model or forgot a little bit about it, you'll remember that of all the kids in the school, 80 to 90% of kids are not going to need an intervention other than a comprehensive classroom management system, a teacher who is positive, gives lots of effective praise, bonds, and builds good relationships with the kids. But there's 5 to maybe 15% of kids at tier 2. These youngsters have moderate needs with regards to their emotional state or their behavior pattern. And we deal with that in small groups. These youngsters are pulled out, they have a small group session with a counselor, with a trained educator to help them deal with those issues. Perhaps it's self-control, anger, social skills, something along that line. And then there's 1 to 5% of kids who are very severely involved psychologically or behaviorally, and they need individual interventions to meet their specific needs and address the severity of their emotional and behavioral troubles. Yes, PBIS. It's the best thing we've come up with so far with regards to school-wide interventions, having a school-wide plan, because there's all sorts of research that it's working. And for kids with all levels, whether it's considered at the normal, saying that word with quotes, level, or kids who have pronounced emotional and behavioral difficulties. And we might even have different teams for kids of the different levels. So a tier 1 team, just working with 80 to 90% of kids, would just make sure that the teacher in that classroom is preventing behavioral issues from happening, because the behavior management system is not effective and positive. Some of the other strategies that would be offered to the gen ed teacher in a prevention mode. Now, for our kids who have moderate involvement, well, this team would have members on it who are skilled in the Tier 1 practices we just looked at, but also know quite a bit about the techniques and strategies and practices of ABA. They would be able to sit with the youngsters and carry on a therapeutic conversation. They might have a daily check-in and check-out, whether it's at before and after each class, at different times of the day, or just the check-in in the morning and the check-out at the end of the day, to see whether that youngster met his or her goals for that period of time. They're good at working with parents and developing that school parent team, leading group meetings for those groups of 3 to 5 kids who have similar issues, and we're working on their needs within those meetings. And individual interventions that are easy to implement. We can train the gen ed teachers to use these easily implemented strategies that don't take much time or effort to put into place. And they'd also be skilled, of course, at the functional behavior assessment, figuring out the cause, the reason, the purpose behind that kid's display of behavior. And they would also be skilled in writing behavior intervention plans that really do zero in on that behavior and are effective in changing it for the better. The Tier 3 team is skilled in the level 1 and 2 practices that we've just gone over, but some of the advanced techniques for working beyond surface behavior and getting inside the youngster's mind to help that youngster sort out the world better, develop a different view, develop a stronger pro-social value system. They might be from the cognitive behavioral level, the theoretical viewpoint, the psychoeducational model, or the social cognitive model. They'd be skilled in perhaps the most powerful behavior change intervention we have available to us, the differential reinforcement procedures. You can find out more about those on behavioradvisor.com, and of course On YouTube, there's a video for everything. And they're informed regarding adverse childhood experiences, kids who've experienced traumatizing events during their young, short lives. We will have a learning module on, and we will become more informed regarding ACEs and how we can respond when youngsters have experienced awful events during their young lives. We have reached the tail end of the presentation on mental health services in the United States and their provision within our schools. Should you wish to add to your already full knowledge base, here are some sources that you might decide to check out. I thank you for joining me today, and please join me too at my website, behavioradvisor.com.